Hello, my name is Tennyson E. Stead. I'm a working screenwriter and a working script doctor, and welcome to The Right Stuff. This is the third lesson in the course on how to finish the rough draft of your feature screenplay in 5 weeks. And at this point in the course, you've finished the rough draft of Act 1 of your script. We're going to go into Act 2 and we're going to finish through the midpoint this week. Okay? So when you wrote Act 1, that work began with a list that you made of all of the challenging things that your character had to do in order to move their efforts to achieve their goal from the very first thing that they did, which was the beginning of the story, through the point where they exposed themselves to the risks, the tangible risks of whatever it is that they're trying to achieve. Right? That moment when they've created a situation where things can really start to go wrong for them. That's the beginning of Act 2. Okay? The midpoint is that point in the script when they have pushed their efforts to achieve their goal so far that anyone who stands to lose by those efforts has got to take the gloves off and put everything that they have into stopping the protagonist's efforts as part of their own efforts to achieve their goal. Okay? When we're watching a movie and there's a big action sequence or there's a screaming match in a drama or whatever the case may be at the midpoint of the movie, it's true that that moment reflects the scope of the film and kind of the spectacle of what we can expect to see through the rest of the feature. But that's not why the moment works. That's not actually what that beat is. It's a byproduct. Okay? What it is the fact that the protagonist has been working so hard to achieve their goal that they have escalated the conflict. Every time someone has told them this isn't going to work, or we need you to do things a different way, or, can you please listen to reason, they have pushed and pushed and pushed and pushed and pushed with whatever it is that they're trying to do, to the point where half measures are no longer an option for anyone who can't abide whatever that goal happens to be. Other people have different goals, right? That's where conflict comes from. People trying to use the same resources to accomplish different things. So whatever it is that needs the resources that the protagonist is using, they can't afford to play games. They can't afford to ask anymore. And, in an action film, when you start seeing helicopters in the chase scenes, that's because, the bad guys are no longer concerned with how things look. They're no longer concerned with withholding resources. If those helicopters are illegally owned, they're no longer concerned with getting caught. They're concerned with stopping whatever it is that the protagonist is trying to do, first and foremost. The first thing that you have to do, again, is to make a list of all the things that the protagonist has to do to escalate their efforts from the point where they're really starting to expose themselves to the risks that they're taking, the beginning of Act 2, to the point where nobody has the luxury of playing games with this person anymore. To the point where everyone who has a bone to pick with whatever the protagonist is up to is doing it with the full force that they are capable of. This is the point in the story when most writers start introducing conflict in the form of plot dumps. They start making things happen to the protagonist. They start moving plot into the story in order to raise the stakes. The protagonist needs to be the one who's raising the stakes. So, first and foremost, I am asking you not to just make things happen to the protagonist at this point. Don't bring in additional characters or additional sort of off-camera complications to the protagonist's agenda. This isn't the time for them to be discovering traps that were set by the writer. Okay? There is no time for that, in fact. And here's a good example of what I mean by that. Okay, let's say you have a detective story. And let's say, this is one of those examples that I'm always using with clients. So you have a detective story. You have two characters. You have a serial killer. Now everything's in action. We don't want reaction, which means the serial killer can't just be reacting to the investigation that the police are conducting. For you to have a compelling serial killer, that person needs to be executing a plan that isn't as simple as one dead body. Because if it's as simple as one dead body and the person's already dead, then the action's already over. This person is either trying to paint a portrait in blood, or they are trying to execute an unrelated crime. They're either trying to make money or they're trying to write a manifesto. One of those two things, inevitably. Okay? So the serial killer has this plan. They're executing it, and the first body has hit the floor. Right? You have a detective who is inevitably either trying to build a career or trying to do something for the city that they live in. They have a goal. And obviously, the fact that the serial killer is out there killing people is complicating that goal. So shutting down the serial killer's efforts, figuring out who's doing this killing and why, and arresting that person and stopping the crimes and bringing justice to the situation, that is the goal of the detective in this particular scenario. Could be a private detective, doesn't need to be a police officer. This person could be hired to figure out who's doing these killings. Okay? Or it could be something that they're deciding to do on their own. They could be a journalist. They're an investigator. They're investigating the crimes. Right? So, one of the things that novelists do to move a crime thriller or a mystery forward is they will have the investigator who's investigating the crimes stumble over some kind of clue. They will have a clue drop itself into the hands of the investigator so that that clue can be dissected and so that we can learn more about the crime and about the investigator and how they react to that. That's, again, not how acting works. Actors perform actions as opposed to reactions. So in this particular case being we're writing a movie or we're writing even a play or a TV show or what have you, the investigator needs to do the work of making the discovery of that clue inevitable. We don't want it to be the writer or luck or fate or whatever, the writer who put that clue in the detective's hands. Instead, the detective needs to put that clue in their own hands, which means, okay, instead of just having them chance into a helpful detail, no matter how many layers there are, and let's say they just notice something's amiss, and the noticing of that detail leads them to a piece of information that helps them break the case. That is still a coincidence. The reason why coincidence is something we fight against in screenwriting is because as soon as something happens to drive the plot forward, the characters reckoning with that coincidence are forced to react. And as soon as they start reacting, they stop performing their actions, they stop engaging the audience through their actions, and instead they start trying to sell the credibility of the thing that just happened. And as soon as the actors start trying to sell that, the audience stops watching and they start waiting for something to happen, and the wheels come off the bus, dramatically speaking. We don't want that. Okay? So instead, we have the detective show up on the crime scene and take apart every single detail that they possibly can. They using the best to the best of their ability. And this is where we find out what kind of detective they are and how they think and what they know about the world. They take the crime scene apart to the best of their ability. They break down every piece of information they can possibly find. Okay? It is not your job as the writer to put the right piece of information in that mass of data. That's not your job. They break down that information. And then you ask yourself, what's in there? And let's say there's nothing useful. Okay, there's nothing useful. Can they find something in that data that would lead them to another question they can ask? Or is there an assumption that that character would make based on that data, even that would lead them in the wrong direction? How are they going to sift that data and understand that data? And is there something in there that they can use, either correctly or erroneously, to achieve their goal? If it turns out that they make a mistake, then, you have a plot twist on your hands. because the audience doesn't know it's a mistake. They're just going to follow the detective's efforts to achieve their goal. And ultimately, what happens is that you have two characters in conflict. You have a serial killer trying to finish what they started. They can't finish what they started if they get caught. So they have to be great at what they do, and they're doing their absolute best to achieve that goal. And then you have the detective with a different set of skills and a different personality and a different profile, doing the same thing, doing their absolute best to break down whatever information the serial killer has left behind. You don't need leaps in logic. You don't need them to tap into the quantum theory of it all and just kind of second guess where the serial killer is going to go next. You don't need to create a lead out of thin air, and you don't need to put information in the hands of your protagonist in this situation. The protagonist just needs to keep breaking information down and keep asking questions and keep getting answers to those questions until eventually they land on something that the serial killer didn't think to conceal. That's it. And as soon as they do that, through their own efforts, you have the most earned data point in the history of mysteries and thrillers. You see what I'm saying? It's just the investigative work. The thing that audiences watch is the efforts of the protagonist to accomplish their goal. Okay? Now, because it is so easy and so seductive to start writing passive story beats into Act 2, something that a lot of people recommend is an additional point in your outline right between the first turning point and the midpoint, right smack in the middle of the first half of Act 2, called a pinch. Pinch 1. Okay? Pinch 1 is something that the character does to advance themselves towards the midpoint, to advance the intensity of their efforts to achieve their goal. Something substantial. The truth is, I don't often need to come up with pinches, because if you write in the way that I'm telling you, if everything that the character is doing is to achieve their goal, and if we're letting the actions of that character speak for themselves, then everything that happens on the screen is propelling the plot through the arc. You see what I mean? Everything that happens on the screen is accelerating us. But it might not be a bad idea to sit down and think of something specific that they can do halfway through this chunk of text to really accelerate the stakes of the film through their efforts to achieve their goal. Something substantial they can do to make their success as a protagonist a whole lot more likely. If there's something like that that stands out, it makes a lot of sense to put that thing right in the middle. So if this turns out to be a 120-page script, the beginning of Act 2 started on page 30, go ahead and put this on page 45. That's it. So you're going to go ahead and you're going to make a list of all the things that your protagonist needs to do in order to get to the midpoint where everybody who's working against them is just out of moderate options. And again, it's the effort that people watch. So in this list, the things that you're going to put aren't necessarily the things that are the most emotionally disruptive. It's the things that are going to be physically and mechanically the hardest to do. Right? The things that require the most effort from the protagonist. Because if something's not requiring that effort, then there's not a whole lot of point in watching it. Let me also take a step back and remind everybody that the harder somebody tries to do something and the more they leverage their resources to achieve that goal, the more emotion there's going to be in whatever it is that they're trying to do. People get frustrated. People get exhausted. We don't need emotional exposition. We don't need a scene where a character talks about their feelings to know that they're exhausted. In fact, here's a trick that most actors learn very early in their career and that most screenwriters frankly need to know. You cannot play drunk convincingly, right? If you try to slur your speech, if you shift your balance around, then it's obvious that you're faking. Anyone who's ever been to a college party can attest to this fact. The only way to play drunk convincingly is to play sober. Right? Because nobody ever plays sober unless they have to. The harder you try to maintain eye contact with someone, the more you try to keep your hands from shaking, the more you try to stay on balance, the more obviously drunk you are. Because nobody tries to do those things unless they're super drunk. So it's not about showing that a character's hurt. It's about showing them trying to do the thing that they're doing anyway in spite of the hurt. It's not about showing that a character's scared. It's about letting them try their hardest to be brave. And the more they have to try to be brave, the more scared they are. Which means the emotional layers that you're looking for are not provided to the audience here's a moment where they're in a car chase and then here's a moment where they have to deal with their panic. No, they are suppressing their panic in the car chase. If they're a scared person, they're going to drive scared and they're going to drive confident to the best of their ability. So you've got those emotional layers layered right into whatever it is the character's doing. And there's one other point that I want to make here, which is that sometimes in order to accomplish a goal, people need support. Sometimes they need help. So, on the one hand, you don't need to have a scene where a character, sits in the hallway crying, and then another character comes in and tries to make them feel better. You don't need that scene. You don't need the scene where the grizzled detective stops on the way home from work and pours themselves a glass of whiskey at the bar. Even if the lighting outside, the orange lights of the street are coming through the bar window and hitting that whiskey just perfectly, it's going to feel like a break from the movie. It's going to feel boring. It's not going to help the pacing. It's going to kill the pacing. Because it kills the stakes. If that detective has time to stop for a drink on the way home, then they're not putting everything they have into this case. What you can do is have that character pour themselves a flask on the way to work the next morning. Because that's when they need the medication. You can have them prepare themselves for the day to the best of their ability. If a character needs emotional support, they can go get it from someone who has other things to do. And now you have conflict. You see what I'm saying? Characters build relationships, not because the movie needs a love story, but because that character needs emotional support to accomplish their goal. They're building the relationship because they can't do it alone. And the conflict in that relationship comes from the things the other character is trying to do to accomplish their goal. And if the relationship is the resource that both of these characters are using to accomplish their individual separate goals, then they're pulling that relationship in two different directions. And the harder they have to pull, the harder the other character has to pull to get what they need, and the more conflict you get. So if a character needs emotional support, don't give it to them. Let them go get it. And if they're not going to go get it, then they don't need it bad enough. Everything a character does is for the sake of their goal. It's for what they're trying to accomplish. But that doesn't mean every single character is going to go about their goal in exactly the same way. Everybody has different needs. How a character pursues their goal tells us who they are. So when we talk about action being character, this is what we're talking about. There's plenty of material just from the things your character needs to do, and even just the things that are going to be challenging, to get you from the point where they start really exposing themselves to the risk of what they're trying to accomplish, all the way through to the point where they're forcing everybody who's working against them to stop worrying about safety and appearances and just do whatever it takes to make sure that their agenda is a success. And as a result, you're not going to need to throw plot at the character. You're not going to need you're not going to need passive storytelling. So here's what you're going to do. You're going to make a list of all the things your character needs to do to get from the beginning of Act 2 to the midpoint of Act 2. And then you're going to write each individual scene where they do that thing. Just be attentive to the fact that Every character who comes into that scene is there to accomplish goals of their own. They're not here to help the protagonist. They're there because they need to be there for their own reasons. Let them keep working. And maybe they care about the protagonist's goals. It's not that they don't care. It's that they also have an action and a motivation. They can't afford to sideline their goals because their goals are that important. Right? Because that's where the conflict comes from. Let it be the protagonist's job to figure out how to get the things they need to make their goal a reality, and let the other characters focus on what it is that they're trying to do, and let those characters be defined by how they go about that. Sometimes it can be listening and making sure that somebody feels heard so that you can ask them for what you need without them losing their damn mind. Each character is doing their best based on who they are, what they're capable of, what relationships they have available to them, and every character might need to make compromises to their own abilities, but they're certainly not going to make compromises when it comes to the success of their goals. And that's what keeps the conflict escalating to the point where the unsustainability of what the protagonist is trying to achieve starts revealing itself at that midpoint. So by the end of this coming week, you're going to be halfway through the rough draft of your new screenplay. Congratulations. Thank you very much for being here for the right stuff, and I look forward to learning with you. Have a good week.